Welcome, everybody, to my presentation about the very first envoy from the United States to Mexico, and I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail. My reason for going into all this detail is I think it's important to hear and know how, right from the get-go, the United States, to a very serious degree, involved itself in the political and governmental affairs in Mexico and the detrimental effects our involvement had on Mexico's stability in their very early years. Mexico, a little bit of background, Mexico got its independence from Spain in the year 1821, and understandably, the United States had interests in this new next door neighbor of ours, Mexico. For this reason, President James Monroe sent a special emissary to Mexico in 1822 to represent our American interests. And as you can see from the slide, his name was Joel R. Poinsett. He was a physician and a diplomat. This was going to be the first of his two missions to Mexico. Now, if his, a little bit of an aside here, if his last name seems suspiciously similar to the red and green plants so commonly seen around the holidays here in the United States, the poinsettia, that's because it's named after him. The species is native to Mexico, but Joel Poinsett introduced it into the United States in the 1820s. Now, it was clear by this time that the United States had a very strong appetite for land. Some examples include the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, westward expansion, the Louisiana Purchase, Manifest Destiny, and so on. Because of this, some Americans who presumably had a lot of pull and authority weren't satisfied with the results of the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, especially in terms of the boundaries between the United States and Mexico. So, one of the priorities given to Poinsett was to try to negotiate territorial deals with Mexico. So he was charged, Joel Poinsett was charged with trying to buy a vast, enormous area of territory from Mexico, which was to include Texas, New Mexico, which included Arizona at that time, it was a territory, California, and parts of northern Mexico, which would include Sonora, Coahuila, Nuevo León, and parts of Baja California. So, as you can see from the outline on this slide in red, this was a massive amount of territory. Mexico thought about it and said, no, gracias. Because Mexico, our next door neighbor, was a brand new nation, like I said before, our country, the US, had an understandable interest in their political and governmental affairs. So I think some background here would help. In 1822, a key figure in helping Mexico get its independence from Spain, Agustin de Iturbide, the man on the left, had been chosen as Emperor of Mexico. And things went horribly and quickly wrong between him and the Mexican Congress. So it became rapidly apparent that Agustin de Iturbide's administration was becoming weak and divisive. Well, this worried us, the United States, and an important part of Joel Poinsett's role was to keep tabs on just what was going on in Mexico. The next year, by the spring of 1823, Emperor Iturbide was pretty much pressured to step down, to abdicate. He was sent off or exiled off to Europe, and he was ultimately replaced by the man on the right, President Guadalupe Victoria. By 1825, the United States had given official recognition to Mexico as a sovereign nation. March 5th of 1825, which was the next day after his inauguration, President John Quincy Adams sent Joel R. Poinsett to Mexico on his second journey, this time as a plenipotentiary. Now, this is important. A plenipotentiary is defined as, quote, a person, especially a diplomat, invested with the full power of independent action on behalf on behalf of their government. End quote. What this means in practical terms is now he had much more authority during his second trip to Mexico, and his actions there, however, would make him a very controversial and very disliked man. The instructions given to American envoy Joel Poinsett regarding his mission were, quote, to lay for the first time the foundations of an intercourse of amity, commerce, navigation, and neighborhood which may exert a powerful influence for a long period upon the prosperity of both states. End quote. As well, he was expected to express to Mexico that we, the United States, were supportive of Mexico's struggle to gain independence, that we recognized and respected our mutual border, that we were flattered they had patterned their Mexican Constitution of 1824 after our United States Constitution, and that we stood ready to help explain any and every aspect of our Constitution. However, according to historian Henry Bamford Parks, and I quote, the Mexican Republic had developed a violent suspicion of its northern neighbor with its aggressive land hunger, and this suspicion was encouraged by the British. Nor did the first American minister to Mexico, Joel Poinsett, succeed in dispelling it. A well-intentioned but tactless person, he flung himself into Mexican internal politics on the side of liberalism. He was accused of trying to foment a civil war under cover of which the United States might appropriate Texas. End quote. So, what exactly did this man Joel Poinsett do in Mexico that got the Mexicans so upset? Once he got there, it was his perception that conservative centralists were trying to disrupt the liberal federalist. Now, in Mexico, federalist means decentralized or more regional type mentality. So he had a concern that the conservative centralists were trying to disrupt the liberal, federalist, and secular Mexican government. He, though, was an ardent Federalist and liberal and felt compelled to insinuate himself in Mexican affairs to try to protect the status quo. It's important to know that throughout the first 10 years, the first decade of Mexico's existence, two main factions of the Freemasons were playing a very important role there. First of all, the Scottish Rite Masons were seen as conservative, pretty unfriendly to liberal Mexico, and not all that friendly to the United States. And second, the York Masons, also known as the Yorkinos, were more liberal and friendlier to the Federalists in Mexico. Poinsett took sides. Poinsett sided with the York Masons and in doing so had insinuated himself deeply into Mexico's political and governmental affairs. Actually, not only did he side with the York Masons, but the York Masons were based from the New York Masonic Lodge, and it was this American envoy who, according to some, introduced and was able to establish the York Masons in the country of Mexico. Because of his over involvement in Mexican political matters, one of the states of Mexico, called Veracruz, in June of 1827, issued a very strong condemnation against Poinsett. Along with that, some in authority in Mexico had a disdain for the Masonic factions in general, and they greatly objected to Poinsett taking sides in all of this. In fact, some in the Mexican government felt strongly that Masonic organizations should be completely outlawed everywhere in Mexico. This American envoy continued to adamantly claim that he had no interest in Masonic affairs and he wished for a prosperous Mexico. In the meantime, back in the United States, American President John Quincy Adams was receiving some reports about Poinsett that were unsettling, while other reports portrayed his performance as satisfactory. Now, because the York The York Masons, the liberal York Masons, by 1826 had become so strong, the Scottish Rite Masons started to claim that much of this power shift in Mexican politics could be directly attributed to Poinsett's influence. Poinsett supported President Vicente Guerrero, who, guess what, was a York Mason. Well, the Scottish Masons viewed this as subversive and they objected to it. Soon, in fact, the conservative Scottish Masons put forth the so-called Plan of Montano, which had four objectives. One of these objectives, which I will share, and I quote, was the supreme government shall, without an instant's delay, furnish the envoy of the United States to this republic, Poinsett, with his passports to leave the country, end quote. So clearly, this objective specifically targeted Poinsett for expulsion from Mexico. This movement, inspired by this plan of Montano, did lead to an armed conflict in which the revolutionary faction failed. Okay, so in addition to all of this, the presidential election in Mexico that took place in 1828 was largely seen as a sham. Vicente Guerrero, who was a liberal and a York Mason, lost the election, and Manuel Gomez Pedrazas, a centrist or an impartial, won the election. But Pedraza was subsequently ousted, and Vicente Guerrero was installed in his place. So some Mexicans saw these events as even more evidence of the sway of this foreigner, Joel R. Poinsett. Although for some time the selection of Vicente Guerrero was pretty much widely accepted, suspicion and criticism of Poinsett continued. Some thought that if the United States were truly sincere in their support of Mexico's well-being and their future, they would recall him. July of 1829, the legislature of the state of Mexico. Now, it's important to know that within Mexico, there's an actual state called Mexico. The legislature of the state of Mexico wrote to President Vicente Guerrero of their strong desire to have Poinsett kicked out. Their accusations were based on claims that he was subversive and his presence was the cause of discord in Mexico. Similar requests from other Mexican states ensued. He repeatedly defended his actions to the American administration and claimed he had the support of Mexican President Vicente Guerrero. Ultimately, though, the pressures to which he was being subjected did lead him to resign from his post and request his own return to the United States. By this time as well, Mexican President Vicente Guerrero was so disturbed by all this upheaval and turmoil caused by the perception of Poinsett's actions, he also requested Poinsett's removal. Poinsett's term as American envoy can rightfully be seen as the United States getting off on the wrong foot with Mexico. He, Poinsett, would soon be replaced by this man, Anthony Butler, who would act as America's envoy to Mexico from 1830 to 1835. Some, maybe many historians view Anthony Butler as a manipulative, conniving, fast talker with too many personal, self-serving, and political motives. He didn't even speak Spanish. He had no international diplomatic experience, so he could understandably seen as a really bad fit for this job. To make matters worse, Anthony Butler, on three separate occasions, tried to commandeer the territory of modern day Texas away from Mexico. He tried to use trickery and threats, and it didn't work. In regards to Anthony Butler, once again, the United States during this time in history had not done well in terms of its relations with our next door neighbor to the south, Mexico.